Okay, looks like most people have joined us today. A few things before we get started. If you have any questions at all during the webinar, please place them in the Q&A window for us to collect. Towards the end of the presentation, our speakers will be able to respond to them. Today's webinar is Going Beyond Translation with API. Our speakers today are Philip Steiger and Arjun Jaggi, both are technical account managers here at SYSTRAN and are experts in all things neural machine translation. We're very excited today to give you a crash course on the capabilities of SYSTRAN's REST API and demonstrate ways to leverage it to ensure an effective and efficient global communication. So that said, I'm going to pass it over to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thank you, CJ. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Arjun Jaggi, and I work as a technical account manager here at SYSTRAN, based out of San Diego. I'm a highly successful technologist with 10 plus years of experience in closing key technology deals and delivering innovative solutions to complex problems at all levels within the organization. With strong leadership and engineering experience and proven ability to build global teams and put systems in place that enable scalability and rapid growth. I have my coworker Philip with me on the call. Philip, would you like to give a brief background about yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Hi, this is Philip Steiger. Happy to be back here and covering a really interesting aspect of this, the API. I'm a technical account manager. I've been here for about 9 years, I think. Time flies, and the technology has evolved a lot. So you'll see a couple of topics here that will be a little bit of a history lesson, but a lot of it is forward-looking and really what's happening now. I've been lucky enough to learn a few languages as I grew up, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and a few others. And it's always interesting to see the connection between technology and human languages. In fact, my background is in programming, electrical engineering, and 3D graphics. So anything that's related to programming and API in this particular case is of particular interest for me as well. So looking forward to a very loaded session.
Thank you, Philip. Now I'll walk you through the agenda of what we are expecting in today's webinar. So we'll discuss what's an API, and where you can find the documentation of that. We'll start with fetching hello world from that. Then we'll understand the basics before getting really serious about it, right? We should have our strong foundation before going deep down. We'll go through translation APIs, profiles APIs, and then understand dictionary APIs, the corpus API, the statistics, the monitoring part of it. We'll also go through some use cases and the best practices. After that, we'll open the stage for discussions, comments, and if anyone has any questions for us. Over to you, Philip.
All right, so excellent. You see on the right side, there's quite a number of different zip files here. And that's really what it's all about. What is a translation API? And there's a general answer to that, right? An API is an application programmer's interface. So this is evidently not for the end user. This is for the programmers, the developers, the application developers. It's how your software communicates with other software. It could be, in fact, even communicating with some hardware, registry levels, or with a server in our case. So this is what essentially allows you to integrate translation into your application. It's how you can create your own applications. You can script things. You can use Java, JavaScript, C#, Python, many different ways. And in most of these cases, you need some sort of a URL to get to from software A to software B, or like the translation server. You need a URL, and you need some sort of credentials. Typically an API key nowadays. In the past, that used to be something like a username password pair. But that's basically it as a minimum. Plus, usually there may be some parameters, right? Depending on what is it you're asking the software to do. You're asking to translate, but that's not the only thing by far. There's lots of other things you can do. And there may be some optional parameters. And so hopefully today we can give you a sense of some of the vast options that we have here, right? And especially the documentation. We've gone through many different types of documentation. Used to be PDF files for everything in a single PDF. We've gone into a newer format called Swagger. And so it's structured in different ways. And you can use that as a developer to quickly find answers to how do you use that particular mode, this particular function, what's the data structure, etc. Here's one example, in fact, that may interest you if you have already done some development in the past with the Google API, Google Translate API. It has a few functions that you need. Really, the minimal is to translate. You can see, get the API version. That's important if you want your application to be somewhat forward-looking and able to see whether it's still talking to a server of the same generation and has the same capabilities, the same syntax, what languages are supported in your license or in your deployment, and so on. So there's a variety of features you could quite easily use without having to recode. Right? If your software allows to simply say, well, let's use a file that says where the URL is and what the credentials are, then you're pretty much set to start switching to SYSTRAN. If, for instance, you need your translations to become more secure, more private, more material behind your firewall without going out to the cloud. And that's a typical scenario if you want to migrate to that environment. Now, before we go into the deep of it, I wanted to do a little simple exercise, and a lot of you programmers that have done your introduction to programming at different levels, you'll relate to that. The hello world is of course what you do when you're presented, let's say in a basic programming or in C, C#, C++, Java, any programming language. You want to see what can you do to bring on the screen the letters hello world. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to go beyond. We're going to see, well, how can we translate it to something else, like to Spanish in this case. So like I mentioned, you need a URL. In this case, I'm talking to my own server. It's on a local IP address. It could be an IP address, a domain. You may need a port. 8903 is the default for us. You might need a protocol that's different. This one is not SSL, but you might use HTTPS if you have an SSL certificate. And then, of course, you'll want to indicate the source and the target language. The target is required, right? It doesn't know what you're thinking about, but the source language could actually be left for the system to detect. There is a language identification option. Most importantly, though, you need to indicate who are you? Are you allowed to request it, right? This is the key, the API key. And in fact, I can simply test this by clicking it. And if I bring this browser right in here, you can see that it just translated hello world to Hola Mundo, talking to that browser with that feature. So it's a quick intro to see, well, how do we get started with coding? But before we really get started, we need to be a little bit serious about what you really need to do when you develop your applications. You want to make sure you can actually talk to that server. Right, so there's a function you need to check on the status. How do we talk to the server? There's a thing called the gateway, and that's something you can easily check too. You can see whether it's actually responding with yes, I'm here and I'm healthy, and you can talk to me. Right, so that's just the communication gateway needs to be there. Beyond that, you want to probably also check what are the languages available on that server. Right? You may have a server initially that's maybe for development with just 2 or 3 test languages, maybe 1 Asian language, 2 or 3 European languages. Later on, your production deployment may need more, and you need to know which languages are actually there. So there's functions needed to check that. Also, when you translate, you're probably familiar with what we do with regard to going beyond a generic translation. We have profiles, so you want to know which profiles are actually available. Is it IT, automotive, legal, medical, that sort of things. And when you translate files, as opposed to chunks of text, is it a text file, HTML, PDF, docx? There's a number of formats supported, even image formats like TIFF, JPEG. These can be running through OCR. You'll want to know what's actually supported on your server because things change over time, and you want to make sure your software can cope with it or alert you if something is not available anymore or not yet. So one thing to typically do is to to query what version is actually the API for some of the features you want to attack. Like for instance, translation, right? I can click that again, and it's going to tell me it's currently at version 2.3.0. And your software could use that to check whether it is indeed at the version that your software was developed for. If, for instance, an earlier version 1.x or 2.1 or something like that was returned, your software might bring an alert message or display or even be prepared for it if you actually coded to it in such a way that it can actually perhaps do things differently or limit the features that the software will expose in terms of translation and other functionalities. For instance, with languages, if you check the available languages, you may want to be specific about, well, check the language for what? Is it for translation or is it for speech transcription? Right? Both may exist. If your server is configured with the multimodal speech capability, that's an option. But if it's configured with that, you can check what are the languages that it can actually transcribe. And independently of that, what are the languages that it can translate? Now, here's a whole lot of responses, a lot of languages, and a lot of profiles, a lot of responses possible from some of these features. The point I wanted to make here is that you have a URL, you can talk to it, but then you can also request specific functions. You have a group of translation features, you have a group of speech related activities, and there's much more. So we'll see a bunch of them here. Here we have a first one about translation. Right, so you can send a request to translate text, but there is more to it. You may want to do this in a synchronous way or in an asynchronous mode, especially with files, right? You can translate a file and wait for it, or you can send a request for translating a file in an asynchronous mode, meaning you're not waiting for it. You're going to come back to it and poll it and find out, what's the status? Is it done yet? Almost like this this trip through the countryside. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And you want to have your application go in a loop and check maybe every second, depending on how quickly you need that or how small or how big these files are, check the status. So you need functions that allow you to do that. And in fact, quite often you want to be able to handle what we call a batch translation. So there's features there where you can create a batch and then simply stuff files into that batch, right? Send files for that batch and it will keep translating and managing and tell you at some point you can query what's the status on those. Again, as I mentioned, you may want to list available profiles supported. There's also a feature called feedback. There's a feedback mechanism in our server, and you may have seen that in the web interface. The feedback mechanism, you can also access some of that through the web interface. Right? So you can add feedback. So for instance, your application may show 2 or 3 different ways to translate a particular word and leave the user a choice to say which one they prefer. Then you can take that in for a feedback. It doesn't also automatically make the change in the server, but it gives you a mechanism where you can go and check that. This is not feedback to us. This is feedback to the translation server. Your resource managers or your administrators can then access that feedback. So there's a bit more than just let's translate and hope for the best, right? You can do a lot more integration with different aspects of it. In fact, here are some of the optional parameters. There are more, but don't want to overload you with too many, but you might want to do a translation where the response is not just the translated result, but also get some additional info, like what profile was used, in case you didn't actually specify it. Or if you requested the profile, but only by some of the selectors, the criteria saying, I need something maybe that's owned by me, not the generic SYSTRAN domain, a variety of parameters and criteria. So you see that at the bottom. There is a number of ways to select the profile. There's also a back translation option. Sometimes that's useful if you, or needed even, if you're doing translations and you want to see if it's actually coming back about the same way. That's, for instance, useful if you have an interactive chat and you want to see it translated, but make sure it still sounds like you were saying the same thing, right? You don't want it lost in translation. Annotations, with annotations can be useful for finding the position of certain terms, and that can be useful for alignment, especially when you're working with material that you want to reconcile in terms of where are the different pieces that are being said in that long sentence. So there's a number of things. Here's another example of what that might look like. If you're doing a request on translation to get the query to supported formats, you'll get a long list of different file formats. Of course, the most important ones here too: docx, the PPTX, XLSX. There's a couple of others that are the open document formats, ODT, ODS, and so on, and a couple of image formats. PDF can be OCR'd as well. And so we have quite a number of file formats there. Now, beyond doing a translation of either a chunk of text or a file of a particular format, you may want to also manage your dictionary. So there's a whole group of functionality, a whole set of features that are related to the dictionaries. As you probably know, we can have dictionaries or glossaries added to a translation profile. And here you have an API set, you have the API allowing you to manage that as well. So what's in a dictionary? Usually it's collections of terms that you want to translate in a particular way, meaning your way. You have single words or multilingual terms, multi-words to be translated differently. We may already translate them some way, but not in context the way you prefer. So dictionaries you can manage through the API as well. Do not translate, DNT. Those are quite the very common ways to use a glossary, is to have a list of terms that should not be translated because they sound the same, spelled the same, and could be misinterpreted as something else, but you have a particular need. Maybe it's a person's name or a geographic location, right? You don't want Mr. Friendly to turn into, I don't know, Señor Amicalmente or something like that. So it's Señor Friendly. You want some of these things to remain the way they are spelled in their original form. There's also use cases for dictionaries that you might want to use when you detect something like misspellings and you want to enforce a proper translation, even if the source has a misspelled word or a word that is not capitalized the way it usually should be. So there's a number of use cases and scenarios in which dictionaries can be used in a somewhat static ways, but even more so with dynamic use through the API. And you can see here on the right side, there's a number of features that will be very handy when you start working in a programmatical way through the API with those dictionaries. Here's an example or two that things you can do. Certainly one of the things you'll want to know, well, when you create dictionaries, when you add something to a dictionary, what are the languages that a dictionary can actually support? And that's not necessarily the languages that you can use during translation. Right, those are two separate things, but you can create dictionaries and then maybe later on you need to add a license for a particular language if you realize, yes, you're going to actually use that. So these are the many languages that are currently supported. When you do, you look at the function here, resources, dictionary, supported languages, right? Pretty straightforward to query. You just need to have the API key here showing you are authorized to make that query. Here's another example. Where you look at the list of dictionaries, right? So you want to either create a new dictionary or you want to look at the existing dictionaries, right? And in fact, I'm going to click that to see that exercise again. So here's an example of a dictionary, a list of existing dictionaries on that server. And once you have that, typically what you'll do in your application, you'll identify the ID, the dictionary ID, and you'll start using that for your commands through the API calls. All right, in a very similar ways, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but there is, to grasp the idea that this is more, it's about more than just translation. It's also about managing resources that help the translation, and the dictionaries, glossaries, of course, are part of that. This is another part of it. That's the translation memories. We call it corpus also, especially when it's in the context of machine learning or training, but in a more broader sense, it's typically what we also call a translation memory, right? You have pre-translated sentences, and these may be because they are commonly seen. Maybe you're translating chat content and there are greetings that are seen again and again. Maybe you're translating emails and there are taglines or footers and headers in documents, things that are repetitive, signatures, legal disclaimers, a variety of things that, in fact, sometimes they are important to the point where you don't want to risk that the translation of these come out differently. So you manage them. And then usually you start creating a TM, you upload from a file, but you may have actually a scenario for, or a use case for managing the content of these in a programmatical way. So once again, we have an API that allows you to manage the dictionaries through that. It may be that your applications are doing some searches, maybe you have a CAT program of your own, a computer-aided translation tool, or a translation memory management system that you're developing internally. We have a lot of scenarios. We see a lot of cases where big deployments, big customers, maybe a game company, they develop their own internal tools, and that can be typically a CAT tool as well, or a TMS. Another scenario for that is that you may want, based on feedback or based on validations from users, you may want to collect these sentences, not just for immediate use in future translations, but also to have a place where you can then collect them from the translation memories, and then put them into a training session. Right, coming soon is our Model Studio Lite by the end of this quarter, and you will be able to use these same translation memories perfectly in Model Studio to actually train the translation engines used in the profiles. Now, this is perhaps one of the most important ones among the other things you can do. It's statistics, and especially the activity API, right? Well, actually, it could be the other way around. You could see, well, what services are running or who's using them, right? Typically, you may have a server that you're actually going to charge to your different departments. A large organization may have different organizations, different departments interested in using your translation server, and you want them to pay a fair share of the cost of having it. So you need to see, well, how much have they used it? And so that's what this particular API group addresses, is accessing the activity. End user, like how many users, how many words translated, what languages, to see where the popularity is, what tools are using them, and so on. Another category here is actually kind of to create your own tools for a heartbeat, or sends a ping, you know, how healthy is the system. Verify that everything is working as expected, right? And that's really important too. So here are some examples. This goes back to I think about a year ago, version 9.4 introduced a new group, this API for the SPNS Health. And so you have features like getting the detailed activity. And that's very loaded, a lot of details about every single transaction. There's also a global, and there's a few other levels. So the global activity might be perhaps more interesting. Here is an example of querying the activity at the global level. And that's typically because you want to get numbers on, for instance, how many characters did we translate this month? Right, or on a daily basis, or whatever. So a number of different criteria. You might want to see how many of the sentences you're translating are actually cached from prior translations the same day or a few days earlier. If you have caching enabled, it's something you can actually disable, but it helps in the speed. So assessing whether you actually have material that is somewhat repetitive, especially if you translate emails with the same taglines, the same repetitive statements, even in technical documentation, when you translate them, quite often you have similar sentences or titles and entries in a table and so on, that can be of big value, a great value to have the caching enabled. And then, of course, you'll want to see, well, how long does it take on average to translate these? Maybe were there any failed translations? That's something you see here. Is there any significant language? Is there any language where we see a lot of translation failing, and so on? So sometimes that can be useful in determining, well, what might be the root cause for that. Of course, most importantly, also find out what are the languages you're using. Maybe you licensed a server with 20 different languages, but you're not quite sure if which ones are actually used the most. And that statistical information you can, of course, access through the web interface, but you can also access it through the API. And that's the great thing, is that you can develop your own tools to manage it. Here's an example of the other thing that we can also do with the activity API. That's to check the status, the health status of the system. You see the 20 20 or so different modules. And at the end of the day, the only one you really care about to see as an IT admin is to see that failed is 0, right? That all of these services are running healthy. If any one of these is failing, it's not necessarily a showstopper, right? It's a highly scalable, highly modular system. Some of these are not essential to actual translation. Some of these are needed maybe just to do dictionary creation or indexing the translation memory and so on. So some of that will still allow you to translate even if it's showing as it's down, right? But it's still great to have the ability at the API level to develop your own tools that gives you maybe a little alert or a notification when something is down, and you can classify it as critical or not. So I think we had a good quick intro on some of the things that can be done. Let's take a look at perhaps some use cases to further discuss or explore and do some mind games here, right? One of the things we see quite a lot, people ask us, can we integrate this into your web-based application, a web page, a website, an application of sorts? And yes, usually it's quite doable. It depends, of course, on what that application allows. Now, sometimes it's not really an integration. It's more like in the web browser, we have a toolbar. We can simply translate whatever the browser is showing. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. We're talking about actually writing some JavaScript code to say, can we do it? Can we make it so that the data I'm working with in my application can be presented in a different language? And so that's usually quite simple. That's quite easily done if you know JavaScript or if you know Python or whatever the tool it is, whatever the tool is that your application allows in support of some sort of integration with something else. Usually the question is, does your application have an API? And for instance, a REST API. Does your application allow communication with some other application, like our server? And when that's the case, if it has, for instance, extensibility with JavaScript, you can quite likely put some JavaScript together to make something appear translated. Right? So you'll need probably some JavaScript file. You'll need some code added in your HTML that references the JavaScript and that prepares it for translation. Here's a very simple example based on what we just saw on the slide before. The idea is to simply show me some sort of text box, an input text box. You could type something in there. Maybe you go beyond and add some speech recognition mechanism by which the text actually comes in from the microphone. And as you do that, you want to select the language and have it translated. Right, so that's a pretty quick thing to do. I think I have an example we can possibly take a look at. Let me see here. There it is. And in fact, you know, depending on what your use case calls for, you might want to have it in such a way that it appears better in a vertical layout. So the target translation might be below the top where the source is. And that's because maybe you're going to use that on a smartphone. Now, you might want to go beyond and actually use full deployment of an API, of an app. Of an app. So if you're developing the app, same thing, you're going to communicate with the server for translation. But basically, this is it. You know, you could also take the existing translation here and copy that and replace this one here. Change this to say, well, it's French, and now I want to have it translated to English. And so that translation is what the JavaScript code is doing, is sending it to the server sends it back, and you display it. So that's one use case, quite easily done in many different ways. You're the expert in Java, do it. You're the expert in JavaScript, in Python, do it. There's really a lot of different ways to fit translation into your existing environment. Here's another use case, and this one is to use the API, not really to do translation, or maybe not just yet, but simply to sort files by what they contain, by what language. In fact, in this case, audio files. Right, so add a challenge. And so typically, let's say you have a scenario where somebody hands you a couple of thousand files and they're all MP3 files or WAV audio files. You can listen to them, but you're not going to have time to listen to each of them one by one to sort them. And they were not given to you with files where the name indicates what language they are. right? I mean, if the file name indicates it, you just use that to sort them. But if you don't, if you have to have it analyzed for the audio, you'll need something like a transcription service. That can actually be integrated with our server for subsequently also doing the translation. So when you do a translation of a WAV file, you can have it do the transcription and the translation together. One request to do two things, but there are really two things. There's a transcription needed, so the audio turns into a text format. Then we do the translation as the second phase. What we're looking at here is essentially a script we can easily put together where we use the API to simply say, let's go and analyze it with that function that checks what language it is, but just for transcription. And let's not go translate it yet. Let's just figure out what it looks like. Right? So that's the scenario, and that's one of the things you can do with the let me see if I can go to that with the API. So I'm going to go and grab this file here. And this one was an earlier different one. Let me go to that particular example. So here I have a folder called find the language audio files, and it's really just a couple of test files to get an idea. Okay, so these are WAV files. The file names are not telling you what language it is, at least not very clearly. Some of the words, mission could be English, mission could be French, bonjour is probably French, after is probably English, but we don't know for sure. And so this script, pretty much this loop that we see here, will essentially run the files through analysis. Now, if it's a 1 minute file, it will take a minute to listen to. If it takes just 10 seconds, it was probably a 10-second recording. But for each of those, what you're going to see essentially is, hey, let's send it over to the server. Let's ask with the function that we have to query the language of a document. Let's ask what language it is. And so you could then filter it based on that and say, well, let's only look for the ones that are French. I'm going to need to have them translated into English. If it's already saying it's in English, no need to keep it, no need to process it, if you will. All right, so here we have an example where in real time, it's running one audio file after another through the analysis. Some of them go a little bit faster. Most of them will be either English or French, I think, in this case. It could be different, right? In some cases, the audio, in particular, audio files can be very tricky. You could have a failure, like an error saying could not detect it. And that may be because it's too noisy or too many people speaking at the same time. It's not a clean recording. There may be music. There may, in fact, be no audio, like no speech at all in that particular file. So these are the type of things that you'll discover as you start working with it. It could be too big to handle, right? There's a limit to the file size. It could be noisy, bad format, bad encoding. There's a whole number of challenges in audio itself. Another scenario that might also be really interesting for using the API is that you want to do some mass actions or mass translations of your own. Here you see on the right side a screenshot that dates to a couple of years ago. That was not even done with the REST protocol. This was done with the SOAP protocol, I think. But the idea was to say, well, I have a whole bunch of files and I want to translate them, but not just to one language. So give me a list of languages to which to translate. Or in a simpler way, perhaps, okay, give me a whole bunch of files and here's a list of all the languages I need them to. And so can you quickly create a script to do that? Right, so this is something you'll typically see when you have, let's say, e-discovery, or you're having a massive amount of tech docs, or let's say learning material that you want to translate into your 20 different languages. So it's not like you're doing one language at a time. You're trying to send a single file off into 20 different languages. And that's a fairly quick and simple thing to do once you have the API and you're using a script, for example, to put this together. So I wanted to show that as an example. You might have in a script something like identifying the source language. Here's an example where you're going from English, and then a target list, like a list of not just one language, but multiple languages. And so you use that to create a loop. There's an outer loop here, and then inside the loop, there's a second loop where you say, well, we'll do this for each language in that target list. Right, so we're doing an outer loop for all the files. In this case, they're all text files, keeping it simple. That's a very typical scenario in e-discovery when you have extracted text, because you work with it maybe in Relativity or some other tools, and now you can also have them quickly translated into other languages. And so the output might be, perhaps you need to actually sort it, not just do this, identify or translate them, but actually keep them automatically sorted into different targets, put them into different placeholders, right? So your script might check whether you have the folder already or whether it needs to be created. And then for each of the languages, have them translated and automatically direct them there. And I'd like to show that as well. So we have one folder up, two dots here. There you go. Here we go. We go to a batch translate. So we have a couple of files, about 200 or something like that. And they're all relatively short text files, maybe 10 lines, maybe 1,000 characters. So they're not super big. They're representative of text messages or maybe short emails, that sort of things. And we have a couple of folders that already exist. Maybe a few more are needed. Most importantly, we'll run this to say, let's go and translate each of these files into each of the languages from the list, right? So it's checking, yep, okay, we have the target folders already, and now it's translating, right? Now I'm running this on the server where the translation is happening as well. So it's pretty quick. And on top of that, some of these may already have been translated. They may still be in cache. Some of them will be a little bit slower. It all depends on how fast your server is. In fact, I think I have another window open here somewhere where we can see the activity. Let me see if I have it there. So this is the activity on my server, only 8 cores. This is more of an academic exercise in the real world scenario. You'll probably want to be on a server with 16 cores, 24, 40, 50. We've seen servers with 200, 500 cores. It all depends on how much material you want to translate and how quickly you want to go through it. But this is basically one of the things you can do quite easily when you have the scripting capability with the API, understanding how to actually submit files for translating in a massive way. And then this one here, I'm not going to go, this is more of a historical mushy feeling, right? We've done this for a while. We've done this for quite a while. And so the things you can do, this goes back to SYSTRAN Enterprise Server 7, which is where I joined when I first joined SYSTRAN. We were at version 7 about 9 years ago. And there already we were showing, yeah, you can do multilingual chat. That's another very typical scenario where you have something you type in your language, but then when it comes to the receiving end, you see it in a different language, right? So you can, or both. You can. That's most likely in an interactive chat. You really want to see them both, just in case something gets lost in translation or it's not very clear. It's good to have both that option as well. So a few last words on best practices, and really this is just a quick summary of a few things that comes to mind, right? What is it? How do you want to translate things? Should you try to translate the whole thing in one bulk, or should you try to send little bits and pieces, right? The whole thing about network overhead. How much time does it take to send a request? And a small request will take a small amount of time, but it does take at least a starting point. And that little overhead can add up if you do a lot of small requests. So think about when you develop your application, find the balance of trying to do individual requests versus doing maybe the whole thing together, somewhere in between. One thing we do, typically we chunk it. I like that term here. We chunk it so that we have not just a single request. Even though the file may contain a few thousand lines, maybe we can extract 100 lines at a time and send a request for that. That will make it much more optimal because you have a single request and a relatively efficient way to get it there. And then the translation can focus on not just one sentences and be done and have that communication overhead each time. Instead, you're having a real good amount of focus on translating 100 or 200 sentences. And in fact, you may want to do a few of these chunks in parallel. So the parallelism, maybe 3 or 4 threads. And of course, all that depends on the size of your server. How many cores are there? How many can be translating the same language or different languages at the same time? You'll gradually develop a sense for that and a good feel for what makes sense. We do that in our applications, right? In our plugins, in our add-ons, in our toolbars. For instance, in the Relativity Connector, where there's a feature called Mass Action. So in fact, the Relativity Connector that we make allows you to translate multilingual content. So for each document you're translating, you're not just sending it as is. What we're doing in the connector is we are going through a loop where we gather all sentences. So we do a language analysis sentence by sentence, and we are then cataloging that and gathering each sentence that is of the same language. And then we're sending a chunk for that. We're not sending all of it necessarily. If it's too big, we like to keep it again, about 100 to 200 sentences per chunk. And we have that translated. And in fact, allowing, you can configure that, allowing 2, 3, 4 chunks at the same time in a parallel thread. So that allows to make sure the server is never idle. Don't let it rest. Make this beast work for you, right? So it's not going to be, it's going to be busy all the time. And that's how you get the full 100% load and the best performance, by making sure it's not wasting time waiting for stuff, communication overhead, by making sure it's not doing a translation and then waiting for the next one. It already has one piped up. There is a queue in the system. Let's use it. And so in a loop like this, you'll have a lot of activity going on at the same time. And that's basically it for a quick intro to the API. I wanted to open it up to Q&A now.
Great. Thank you so much, Philip. Let's get to the questions that we have here. Let me take a look. Okay, so first question I've got here is, I find it interesting to learn that the API includes commands to manage glossaries and translation memories. Can you discuss a use case where some of the features can be used for anonymization?
For what? Oh, for anonymization.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, and that's definitely something that you can do with the glossaries. Anonymization basically means to hide somebody's identity, whether it's a social security number, a credit card, a person's name, first name, last name, geographic locations, that sort of things. So you could certainly, even without API, you can build a list of things that you want to hide from staying in the translation or from going through translation. So anonymization, even though there are better ways to do it really seriously, that's a good starting point to use the dictionary, the glossary, to say, well, here's a bunch of terms, I don't want to see them. Turn them into a bunch of X's, for example. So that during translation, it's going to keep them as a bunch of X's. Or you could do the detection afterwards. There is a thing that we call the normalization dictionary. So there is a certain type of post-processing that you can do. And all of that you can also access through the API. So if your application has maybe some feedback mechanism or some user input of saying, oh, here's one we shouldn't let through, as you have a reviewer take care of making sure it is clean and ready to go. You could have that use the API call to add the term into the glossary. And that way you can have a growing amount of content in your dictionaries by courtesy of the API getting it in there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question is, what is the Google compatibility mode?
Oh, yeah. So that's what we saw at the very beginning. It's basically a mechanism where you have the ability to use our server for the instructions that you may already have in your application. So the compatibility mode is there really to help migrate when you see the need to have it translate behind your firewall, or on a server that even though you may host it in the cloud, it's going to be single tenant. It's going to be your hosting or us hosting it, but nobody else is going to see the data that's going to go through it. And it's not going to be shared. It's not going to be subject to advertisement analysis or stuff like that. So the compatibility mode is there to allow you to quickly transition your existing application that's using the Google API for translation to have them run, but with the SYSTRAN server.
Okay, perfect. This one is a little bit of a long one. It says there are a lot of API calls that report on server info/status, but have you implemented or considered implementing the ability to configure SPNS, example, assign language models to particular GPU instances through the REST API? I have a lot of SPNS instances that have been stood up and managed and would like to script the setup process.
Yeah, so that's kind of scaling or managing speed of translation, by determining where. I think it's like determining where those resources go. If you have a server with multiple computing nodes, right? Because you can do that. It's scalable. You can have you have a front end server, and then there's multiple compute nodes. Where does it go? I don't know if we have that through the API yet. That I have not experienced or played with, but we certainly have the functionality in the server to determine that for you. What I mean is, if you upload, if you activate a server, if you activate an engine and you say, let's create a profile for it, you can determine where it's going if you want to do that, or you can let the system do that. So you can certainly have it, and you can configure actually the criteria by which to determine that, right? There's a place somewhere in the administration console where you can say what's the most important thing for you when it determines on which compute node that next language goes. The language engine, for instance, for Japanese to English, let's say, should it go on compute node number 1 or compute node number 2? It's going to look at a couple of criteria to make that determination. And you have control. You can configure what is the foremost thing to look at. For instance, how many others are already loaded on there? How much memory is left available? How many CPU cores are there? Therefore, giving you an idea of how fast it's going to be. There's a variety of criteria like that. And I'm not 100% sure. We'll have to look that up to see if there's actually API calls for that already. It may. And you know what? That's the way it goes quite often with these requests when they come from customers. We make that the next feature in a subsequent release. So if that listener could send us, if we know who it is that's asking, we can certainly get back to that person to provide a more clear answer. Because off the top of my head, I don't remember if we actually do that through the API as far as like determining where a particular engine goes. You can launch profiles, but I'm not sure if you control exactly on which compute node it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with questions that we weren't able to answer, and to give some more supplemental information. But I think that's all the time we have for today. Again, for the questions that we missed, we'll send out an email. I guess this includes our webinar for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone had a great time and learned a lot of information about SYSTRAN and our API capabilities.